Yeah, thanks so much. It's so great to be here with everyone. I'm excited to see you all this morning. I am joining you from Michigan in the US. Um, so, what I am working on right now, uh, kind of most relevant to the topic of our roundtable today, I have a journal article coming out later this year about Nikki Tutorials or Nikki DeJager, who some of you may know as a trans beauty vlogger on YouTube and just across platforms as well. But the article looks at her coming out in early 2020 and also how kind of her audience reception to her coming out and the ways in which she and her audience work together to build this kind of new image of herself as a queer public figure. So really looking forward to that. And just briefly, in addition, I am currently finishing up my dissertation, fingers crossed, which is a study of third-party intermediaries in the creator economy in the US. So looking at, for example, influencer talent managers, agents, specific lawyers and tax firms, for example, that work with creators. So within that, I'm really interested in questions of power and representation for all sorts of, minoritized groups, including queer and trans people. So I will stop there. Looking forward to our discussion.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I am going to, I think, try to pick your brain about that later because so much of the talk is about trans representation. And sometimes we think we have to think more broadly about trans participation in the creative industries. Um, but we'll get to that in a moment. Martin, then, would you like to share with us what you are busy with right now and what does has to do with the creative industries and trans visibility?
Yes, thank you, Alan, and hello, everyone, and thank you for opening up the space to have this conversation. Just quickly, I am in Maryland right now, where we have a huge snowstorm. I'm in rural Maryland, so the electricity goes out. So hopefully it won't happen during this wonderful conversation here. So basically about my work, I'm also finishing up an article on trans exploitation, specifically looking at Zulma Lobato, who is an Argentine trans performer who mostly became famous in the late 90s, early 2000s, mostly connected to Argentine tabloid television. And sort of my angle into sort of this research has to do with trans exploitation, thinking of it as a media logic in which travesti visibility is produced basically through extractive practices in the name of visibility. So I'm looking at sort of these contradictions that plays with visibility and further marginalization in the role of more mainstream media. And when I talk about, as part of my research, the concept of travesti, one of my interests here is to really explore how this is a very specific linguistic, cultural uh, term with a very particular political and social history. And I'm referring to trans feminine identities that in Argentina are deeply marked by class, race, and further structural marginalization. I don't use it as travesti as a synonym for transgender, rather as a name that refers to a very politicized identity that emerged through activism, survival economies, and collective struggles in Argentina. But my research focuses mostly on performers in Buenos Aires, particularly among working class and racialized populations. Sort of that is central to my analysis. in order to highlight sort of the global category, how global categories tend to fail to capture the local histories of gender in media. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
That sounds amazing. So we have both an, I suppose, post-colonial lens on trans issues considered broadly, even up to problematizing the centrality of the term trans, but also a focus on exploitation and I think economic reproduction that's sometimes missing from more symbolic arguments about the importance of visibility. Last but not least, Santi, what are you up to right now in terms of the creative industries and trans visibility?
Well, I guess first of all, thanks everyone for having me. Super excited to be here, and there's probably a large emphasis on the multi. I'm doing multiple things at the same time currently. So maybe just to give you a quick rundown, I'm currently actually working on PhD applications and more my writing practice more broadly. I look at trans fashion activism on social media. I'm very kind of interested in how fashion is used as a tool in social justice movements and how trans people specifically are using fashion in a way that hasn't been done before. So that's sort of my topic of interest. And developing more writing on the side, I've got more an article coming out soon called Doing Dragon Gender. And it's looking at how identifying as a non-human gender or looking at how gender expansiveness and gender storytelling could lead us to new creative pathways for exploring transness more broadly. So, in addition to that, as you heard, I run Gender Swap, which is a trans style outreach organization. And I'm currently working with two apprentices, supporting young trans people to co-develop new style and self-expression resources for gender swap channels, including Instagram and the Gender Swap website. So this very much sort of, it kind of all encompasses trans creativity and uh, visibility in a myriad of ways.
That sounds fantastic. I'm so glad that we have a voice from the practitioner side to balance the often academic heavy bent of events like this. But I often say that, well, let's not bore you with this. Let's let you talk. And I essentially have three questions for you folks. Asking about your views of the creative industries, of trans representation, and of social justice. And if that's okay with you, I'm going to ask you in the same order to answer this. And then at the end, we are going to have some time for questions from the audience. So if there is something that you would like to ask Ellie or Martin or Santi, please pop that in the chat. And at the end, we will, one of our moderators will take some of those questions forward. The first one that I have for all three of you folks is to ask about where we are, roughly. A decade ago, Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time, and the media were all abuzz with talk about the trans tipping point. Today, the world looks quite different from the way it did 10 years ago, and it looks different in ways that perhaps we did not anticipate. So, if I ask you to look back through this last decade, what do you think is the best thing, the worst thing, and the most unexpected thing to have happened in terms of the presence of trans people in the media and in the creative industries more broadly? Ellie?
Great. Yeah, that's such an excellent question. I will do my best to give an interesting answer. Um, I will speak to I mostly study social media. Like I said, I studied the creator economy pretty extensively, so I'll speak to that aspect of it. Um, I think there has been a really wonderful and dramatic kind of increase in trans visibility on social media. especially with things like low barriers to entry on a lot of social media platforms, just needing a smartphone and a Wi-Fi connection to get online and share your story, represent yourself has been really powerful. Um, with, for example, my work on Nikki tutorials specifically, I see her as kind of part of a wave of gender and sexual non-normative representation in the online beauty space, which I think is a really interesting kind of departure from what is typically a very an industry that's very dominated by white cisgender women. Seeing Nikki and other, queer people in that space, I think has been really wonderful, of course, and perhaps surprising given kind of the history of, like I said, that the space online. Um, I think in terms of other implications that are perhaps less positive, of course, here in the US and also in many other places, there has been a pretty strong politically charged backlash to increased trans visibility. Um, you know, bills to restrict trans people's participation in sports and, using public restrooms and other, really awful bills like that. So, I think that in the broader kind of narrative of representation of minoritized communities, I think this is something that we see. The backlash stemming after a period of increased visibility or increased social gains for particular marginalized groups. So it's not necessarily, I suppose, something new. I think we can track this with, like I said, other communities. But it is, I would say, probably one of the less positive or perhaps one of the worst, results of the increased visibility of trans people. Um, but nevertheless, of course, this visibility is still very important, perhaps now more than ever. So I will cap it there. I'm interested to hear others' thoughts.
Thank you. Martin.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the good, the bad, and the ugly in the last in the last 10 years. I think in sort of looking at the research that I do, I would say that one of the most positive developments, it's basically seeing trans presence across media that trans people were excluded from. So not just in the sort of behind the screen, but also in front of it. But more important, I feel that has to do with more trans authored work and participation, sort of like I mentioned, behind and in front. And sort of, and this has created different types of cultural productions. So, for example, if we look at serialized narrative forms, there's kind of been a move away from more of these like singular narratives of transition and into more
Mhm.
broader recognition that trans people are not only sort of like the subject of representation, but they can also be producing those serials that which they may be about. So I see that as like sort of a very positive move, but at the same time, there's while there is growth and more representation and more presence, there really is a persistence in some cases of like kind of like this intensification of exploitive media formats that are not only limited to sort of more of the traditional media platforms, but also now because of social media, it's sort of made that even bigger.
Mhm.
Um, right, what we can, well, my work tends to focus more on like kind of pre-social media, but now that social media is present, right, it's sort of like platform that even more, whereas people didn't have to sort of deal with that in the past. So more elements of concrete labor exclusion, more public and private harassment because of social media, further economic precarity because of sort of this further exclusion. But also in thinking of what I've seen in sort of in the last 10 years, but also working as an academic,
Mhm.
I think one of the biggest problems is that we many times try to talk about sort of progress and regression in kind of like linear terms, where like we in theory talk about, there was nothing before and then it grows over time and it's a success. And I think that that's a big mistake that we tend to do in trying to sort of get out research so that explains this. So rather than looking at like linear, it's more like cyclical. And I think once we shift to that, it makes more sense about how different groups access power and lose power because of like certain backlash that may exist socially, politically, as we're seeing now in Argentina, after in theory we saw like this linear progression. And now we're back. But we saw that in the 60s, we saw that in the 70s, we saw that in the 80s. So it's not new. It's just like maybe the context shifts a little bit because of different sort of media platforms that may exist. But just sort of to close the idea is trying to move away, or at least I try to move away from like this linear narrative of expansion, inclusion that doesn't always work out that way.
I'm thinking, on the basis of what you were just saying, that perhaps we are getting to the point where we have to start thinking of a wave model of transvisibility with different patterns at each time. Although, while I throw this idea out, if anyone has a hunger for theorization. And then we turn to practice. Santi, from your end, um, what's the best, the worst, and the most surprising to have happened in this last decade in terms of trans presence in the creative industries?
I think I'm going to speak on the fashion industry, not that I work in fashion specifically, but sort of on the periphery of it. Um, I think the best thing definitely has been, and I know Ellie already kind of mentioned this, but is the increased representation of trans people within fashion, representing different identities, bodies, experiences, different genders more widely. Um, on top of that, I've also noticed that there's been a massive increase in trans apparel companies and fashion brands, um, where there's now kind of clothing lines that cater to trans masculine people and so on and so forth. Although in saying that, a lot of these brands and these trans-led brands are also born out of the fact that still, even though kind of leading into the bad, even though trans people are being represented and included on runways and catwalks and in commercials, still does clothing designs, brands, fits don't, even shopping experiences don't serve trans people at all. And so there's this thing going on where there's all this good stuff happening, and yet and in part it's also because there's still a lack in some of the main industries that we rely on. The most surprising thing I was thinking about is the fact that trans subcultures have become more visible in the mainstream. Uh, I think largely due to social media. I'm thinking
Mm.
about the diverse kind of expressions, t Tumblr genders, if you will, kind of this wider kind of onset of awareness of kind of more fringe gender identities, which I'm surprised about because I didn't realize that me scrolling gender flags on Tumblr however many years ago would now be something that could show up on someone's TikTok for you page. And so, we're getting everything from Therians, catboys, femboy to even like people who maybe it's not specifically under the trans umbrella, but we're seeing gender nonconformity represented on a wider scale, which does or has did come as a surprise.
Thank you. I totally relate to what you were saying about Tumblr genders. I think there was a lot of theory being born in Tumblr comment threads in the mid-teenies that was very, very instrumental to the fact that I was reading the stats the other day. Apparently, 1984 is the birth year. That's the massive elbow in terms of trans acceptance, people born after 84. And that tracks with them being roughly 30 when when the Tumblr discourse was happening. Sorry. Apologies. Thank you for those thoughts. I think they lead very nicely to my next question. Because one thing that seems to come up in what you all were saying is that back then, about perhaps 10 years ago, we mostly, lots of us had the assumption, or perhaps the hope, that more visibility, more coverage for trans issues would mean more awareness, and that would mean more respect, and that would mean more acceptance, and ultimately more equality for trans people. And the reality, as you have pointed out, has been more complicated with a lot of bad alongside the good. So from your point of view, which is very different for all three of you, what do you think are the main issues? If it wasn't simply enough to have more trans people being represented on the screen or the stage or the social media post, what else still needs to change in the creative industries so that we can make them truly trans inclusive? And I'm going to start with Ellie again.
Sure. So I will tackle this from kind of the second arm of my research, which is the more industry focused. Uh, I think a trend that a lot of scholars and, non-academics as well have documented really thoroughly is kind of the general social conservatism of many of the creative industries. Kind of the um, they're less willing to perhaps take risks. There's a prioritization of profit over social justice issues many times. And one of the ways in which this shows up is, who's able to access these jobs in the creative industries. For example, in the intermediary roles that I study, um, and other creative and cultural industries, who is able to, perhaps take unpaid internships in these like big metropolitan areas, who has the connections in the industries. Something that I see a lot in my interviews is that this little micro industry that I study is based really heavily on um, informal networking.
Mm.
So, it's all about who you know, and there's not a lot of formal channels to distribute information and knowledge, and so it's all about connections. So I think that just like this broader um, trend in the creative and cultural industries, it is hard the access is a big issue in terms of education, information dissemination, and things like this. So, like you were saying, it's really wonderful to see trans people represented in all these different forms of media that we all just were speaking about. But it also matters, who's producing the media, who's making it, who is behind the scenes. And I think that is perhaps an issue that has been under addressed. Um, yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think that this leads really nicely to the point that Martin was making earlier about who profits when this representation happens. So, Martin, over to you.
Yes. Um, I know I'm not going to say something that is groundbreaking, but I think it's important to sort of like repeat this notion that visibility sort of has not led to equality because it's generally sort of like visibility has in media has been tethered to market logics rather than to sort of broader structural transformation. Sort of media tends to overly celebrate, right? The notions of ratings, ticket sales, advertising revenue, brand recognition, but rather than focusing on ways of redistributing that power. So market-driven inclusion, right? It's what's happening rather than rewarding forms of representation that align sort of with existing power relations rather than contesting them, right? They're not contested, they're just sort of reinforcing sort of those power relations that are based on sort of the market. So while we were saying that in the previous question that sort of the good elements that we see more visibility, which is great, but many of those performers or those creators don't gain control over their framing sometimes, or don't have control over the production or their labor conditions. So visibility ends up becoming really a substitute um, for justice rather than a path towards it. So what do we need to change and how that has to happen? You know, it's very difficult for me to state or to come up with sort of like a clear answer. But what has to change is sort of the market logic that governs it. Sort of stop treating again. I'm repeating myself, but it bears repeating, right? That treating visibility as a market metric is not going to create more visibility, right? We need to sort of think about the political, the ethical consequences of that. So perhaps thinking about the ways we create media away from more of these like hegemonic structures, networks that are currently in place, to help us think about whose interests and representation that serves. Thank you.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and I think we can see a very clear difference in the amount of production control that the kind of micro celebrity that Ellie was talking about, who largely makes their own content in their own terms, has vis-a-vis the kind of control that people might have in the more traditional broadcast media, right? But at the same time, with the current developments, for example, in generative technologies, we are going to start seeing, I suspect, a very different set of issues having to do with people's control of their own output, even on platforms where production is entirely left to your own hands. But before we move on to questions like that, which may be coming up in the chat, I am eager to see what's in there. Last but not least, Santi, what do you think we need to change in the creative industries to make them truly trans-inclusive?
Kind of wanted to extend onto Martine's point also, just to add about, and I think this is where tokenism sort of happens, where you just kind of, people are like, oh, we'll just get the one palatable non-binary person, put them here, and we'll just okay, we'll just get, and it just will plunk someone in who's trans just to say that we used a trans person for this thing. And then, like Martine was explaining, then what happens is obviously there's this that person isn't actually in charge of how things are happening, production, script, pay, whatever else. This might be idealistic, but I think what's really missing here is I always think, and I guess coming at this from a gender swap perspective and working within kind of grassroots organizing, is more kind of expanded networks and interconnections between different companies within the creative industries and grassroots orgs. Like people, trans-led organizations that are doing the work to make sure that trans people are represented and included in fair ways. One example I have is in London, there's an organization called Trans on Screen, and they're working really hard to make sure that trans people, not just actors, but anyone working within the film industry, that they're getting jobs and they're being paid well and they can lead on specific in specific positions and so on and so forth. And so I'm thinking about this, but on a larger scale. I think that I would hope to see, and maybe where things have fallen short, is that there's not a lot of cross collaboration happening
Mm.
between different communities and communities, I suppose. Yeah, it's kind of a short answer, but that's, I guess, both an observation and a future hope, I suppose.
Well, that was a really big question, so I am sure that everybody feels sometimes that our answers to questions like that fall a bit short of being comprehensive. But I do think that you were highlighting really, really important things in there. One of my favorite examples, still in London, I'm afraid we're making this more London centric than it should, is the Museum of Transology, as another example of an organization that's very much led and shaped by concerns of the community themselves, and that therefore looks very, very different from the kind of exhibitions about trans that you get being designed by cis people, however well-meaning. Um,
If I,
so
oh, sorry.
yes, go on, go on.
Just to add on to that, to yours, but just maybe in an Oxford context, I'm thinking of Tart Productions, who does a lot of like creative, kind of crafty, trans-led events, but they also collaborate and do exhibitions for like with the Pitt Rivers Museum, for example, which is kind of a nice sort of, crossover, a collaborative approach where two different entities are working together. So, anyways, didn't mean to cut you off, but
No, that is an excellent example, and I should have thought of them as my first and foremost example of. There's a surprising amount of very, very good queer cultural production in Oxford. I love the Oxford Drag Collective as well. They do very, very good things in collaboration, and I hope we will be able to host them at some point. But I do have one third question that I want to ask you folks before I hand it over to the people in the chat. And it is that it seems quite clear from what you all were saying that some of the most exciting developments in trans representation and trans visibility have to do with media that are not just made about, but fundamentally by and for trans people. That's essentially what we were just talking about. So I would like to ask you, from your point of view, what's unique about trans-made media, about its content, about its form, about the way it is made? What exactly is it that changes when we get trans people developing communication and community in our own terms? And I'm going to start with Ellie.
Great. Yeah, this is something that I think a lot about in my work, particularly as it relates to this study I've been working on with Nikki Tutorials. I argue that there's something particular in her kind of self-presentation and the narrative that she crafts about her identity, that's particular to her being a trans woman and the specific experiences that she has, and is also, a particular way that she interacts with her audience and her audience interacts with her. Um, and one of those areas is, like you were saying, the ability to craft your own narrative, tell your own story. When she was coming out, and this was a very high profile kind of coming out for her, that was covered in a lot of kind of global major news outlets. She could have, gone on any number of talk shows or podcasts or anything like that, but chose to do a lot of her self-disclosures and other, sharing experiences on her own YouTube channel, which she produces and, has control over that narrative. Um, so I think that is a big one, just the sense of control. Whether or not, of course, there's complexities within that, like just because you can make these particular forms of media doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be favored by the algorithm or necessarily super visible. Um, but I think this also relates to, more broadly, the creator economy, thinking about, like Martine and Santi were saying, the prioritization of market logics over these issues of social justice and identity and things. I see this in my dissertation work in terms of brand deals for creators, which is the primary source of income for most creators on most platforms. And thinking about, like Santi was talking about, in terms of tokenization, this comes up a lot in terms of brand campaigns for things like Pride Month or other identity-based months, I suppose. Um, and so I think that, thinking about the contrast between, for example, what Nikki is doing and what other creators, trans creators are doing on their own channels, when they are, making media, making content for themselves and for their communities versus um, sometimes what um, the the market pressures kind of have them do, and the ways that folks have to kind of contort themselves in order to sometimes make money, I think is a really interesting contrast. Um, yeah, I'm interested to hear what you two also have to say.
I think that brings together lots of the points that we were discussing very, very clearly. Although the pressures of the market operate differently across different types of media, they are always there necessarily shaping what gets broadcast, either in visible ways or in invisible ones. Martin, over to you.
Okay. I don't know if I have a fully fleshed out answer for this. One of the things that I was thinking about when we consider sort of like the compelling developments in trans representation, I feel occurs when trans people, kind of what we were saying throughout sort of the talk here, when trans people get to create media, not necessarily to explain themselves, but to communicate on their own terms, whether it is from like the production side or the content side. So about sort of being able to communicate in ways that don't have to be palatable or fully legible to cis audiences, right? And I think that part, that refusal to have to be palatable, I think speaks to the importance of authenticity, which authenticity can lead us to sort of a more complicated uses, which we don't necessarily want to go into. But I think authenticity in its most like simplest form, which is sort of the trans experience at the forefront. Um, but it can also be confrontational as a positive element, because it becomes a way, right, of reclaiming a space, reclaiming a narrative. So authentic in that sense, right? That it confronts, it doesn't try to sort of like to play nice, because there's no need for that, right? The purpose is to sort of communicate, situate trans identity in a broader narrative. So really media becoming a space for that survival, for that memory, for that world making, rather than sort of as a sort of explanation for cis audiences. And I feel that's sort of like the strength of sort of media, of transmedia.
Thank you. That is a really, really fascinating answer. So much of the idea, so many of the narratives around trans identities have centered around this concept of authenticity and to thine own self being true, and what that means for the choices you make about your own body. But it does get cast in a completely different light when it's no longer being articulated to meet the gaze of medical gatekeepers, but rather in the terms of the community itself. And I'm going to, on that note, pass it over to Santi for our last response of the evening.
Sure, yeah. And I guess just to add to both Ellie and Martine's viewpoints, I love the creative sort of DIY, kind of like informal fun elements that trans people take on when they create their own media. There's something that I just feel like there's this something that a lot of other people aren't doing. And I guess also touching on Martine's earlier point about linearity, this kind of like, I started here and now I'm here. I mean, there is that within trans creative media, but what I also love is that there's all these alternative experiences that we get to learn about, people who are not medically transitioning, who are maybe just socially transitioning, people who are shifting from one wardrobe to another, not in a binary way, but just switching up styles. You've got detransition stories, which I think are still really important, or retransition stories. All of these different kind of narratives that we wouldn't hear about otherwise. There's also something about trans-led media that's very, it's ever shifting, it's forever changing, and we're still learning something, and we're still constantly creatively engaged. Going, for example, thinking about influencers, someone like Mars Wright, who's a trans man. He's based in LA. He makes his own clothes. He's got a clothing line. He was very much and is very much known for his fashion, but recently he's picked up dancing, specifically shuffling, and talks about going to shuffling class and being in shuffling competitions as a trans man, which is just like, wow, I didn't know we were going to arrive here. I've been following Mars for however many years, and yet we're still learning about just embodying oneself, whether you're trans or not, in these like different, yeah, phases in life, which I think is really neat. And so this, I think, is quite a unique aspect specifically of like, yeah, trans media, which I guess, just can't wait to see more of it. So yeah.
Thank you. So what you're saying is that these trans people keep transing the boundaries of different genres. How rude, right? What an inability to stick to one thing. We might even be talking of queering the boundaries between media forms. Outrageous. I would like to thank all three of you for these outrageous but fascinating contributions, illustrating different ends, different angles, different corners of the creative industries. And because we are in the last event of today for the Creative Industries Festival, I am going to take the liberty to extend our Q&A session a little past the 4 minutes that we have left, dear God, because we have some really, really fascinating questions there in the chat, and I would like to throw at least a couple of them at you. The first one, if you don't mind me taking them a bit out of order, but I think the one that I would like to ask the most, to be honest, is Dominic from the chat is asking, do you have any observations about the different patterns of trans disability in the creative industries more globally? Let's say, for example, Dominic mentions India and Africa, and I know that some of you work with about global majority figures. So anybody who has something to say about this, feel free to take up the question, but you're not required to this time.
I can give one contribution.
So,
I'm thinking about also the kind of content that's produced. I'm thinking about there's more documentaries or like YouTube coverage.
mhm,
I'm thinking about Mickey Blanco, who did a documentary looking at I think queer and trans fashion designers in South Africa. There seems to, I mean, I guess this is kind of a big topic, but I think that that's the only thing I have to add, that I've seen a lot of sort of like YouTube representation, but not so sure sort of in social media or other industries, but
I know, Martin, that you work with Latin American media, so perhaps something from that end, even if it's not specifically the cultural, the corner of the world that Dom was asking about.
Yeah, I can perhaps try to provide an answer here or at least a talking point. I think when we look at sort of Latin American media, because of my research has to do with sort of the traditional network television, I see even though a lot of people claim that television is dead, in Latin America, no, it's still sort of very prominent because of access. To meet different sorts of media, etc. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of countries is kind of like replicating what happens in other nations. There isn't much groundbreaking work happening in sort of like these traditional television networks that have been sort of in place since the 50s. And when they do take up sort of issues that are trans, many times they are sort of downplayed or completely eliminated. For example, there was this very famous telenovela, this melodramatic serial from Argentina, which included a character as central to the story when the format was sold to Brazil and Mexico, that the trans character like completely disappeared, even though that was central to the story. So erasure is part of that sort of that pattern and that trend, that even though it became very popular to have sort of a trans character in one nation, when it traveled just like across borders, it was erased.
Thank you. That is truly truly fascinating. I wish we had something to represent the stupendous variety of trans identities and of regimes of trans representation across the world, but that would have made it a much bigger roundtable than we could manage this time. Let me see if I can take one other question from the chat. Let's see. We are asked, can you speak a little more about how commercial and institutional pressures in the creative sector shape whose stories get told and how? It was touched upon earlier, and really interesting. So I can't remember exactly who that was, but whoever would like, what do you think you can say about how the commercial logics of the sector shape whose stories get told or how those stories get told?
I can jump in first. I think I had touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about how the creative and cultural industries, particularly in the Western world in the US and the UK, have been pretty socially conservative, both in terms of what kinds of media are greenlit, or published or
Mm,
produced, but also, by effect, essentially conservative in terms of who is working behind the scenes. I mentioned some of the elements of kind of lack of access to these kind of cultural production roles. Um, in more traditional cultural industries like book publishing or film or television in the US in particular, a lot of times, you're required to undertake sometimes unpaid internships in very expensive cities like New York or Los Angeles, where the creative hubs are. And that's of course just not accessible to everyone. And we can kind of imagine the kinds of people who are able to take that on. Um, so that's one of the ways I think one of the kind of pressures that shapes what kinds of media are produced and by whom. But there are also the commercial logics. I mentioned, for example, creator brand deals.
Mm,
Who do brands want to kind of be an ambassador for their products? And a lot of times, I found in my interviews, um, talent managers who represent queer and trans creators say that, they're often passed over for a lot of brand campaigns. Um, and the ones that they do get are can sometimes be tokenizing,
mm,
and really only come up during like Pride Month. And even that in recent years has dwindled a lot as
mm,
corporate brands have kind of pulled away from social responsibility and social justice causes. So I think that also really shapes, given that brand sponsorships are one of the more sustainable sources of income in the creator economy, who's getting brand deals really matters, and what kinds of brand deals that they get are they sponsored by like Target,
mm,
or is it, other smaller companies, you know, like for example, we see a lot of queer creators sponsored by, like sex toy companies, and that is wonderful, but also, kind of makes them perhaps less quote unquote brand friendly to other larger companies, and is kind of this like um, cycle that means that they, can't get other sponsorships. Anyway, I will stop talking now if anyone else has thoughts.
that is definitely a great point. We've known that pressures like respectability politics have always been super influential in terms of getting branding support, but in an environment of overt political hostility, then things get increasingly complicated. Um, Martin, Santi, anything you would like to add to this one, or shall I pick a final question?
I, maybe I could say something. I don't know if it's answering specifically to this. I think in going back to what I was mentioning about this like linear narrative from like no representation to full representation, I think that in Argentina, um, that narrative in media has been accepted that trans people are fully accepted. They're part of media, even though that's not the case, but that is what's being reproduced. So when sort of the creative sector creates programming, again, for sort of like television networks, it's now looking at trans representation as kind of like this nostalgic looks of going to the past. So we're starting to see a lot of productions that kind of recreating the 60s, the 70s, and like, oh, look how it was in the past, how bad it was. And the message is like, now it's changed. It's now we're very different, we're very modern, and we, sort of like included trans people. So it's kind of like this nostalgic look, and that's what has been sort of getting sort of financed, supported by sort of like media. So that's very interesting. And now just like a quick example, it's the one network is producing the musical Annie,
Hmm.
and including trans characters. But again, like it's a very strange connection of putting the 30s in the Argentine context. But again, it's kind of like looking at all of these sort of very nostalgic works from the past and including trans characters in them.
It is fascinating, right? We've been trying to make the point about decades that trans people have always been around, although we didn't always look in the same way. And perhaps some of that point is getting across, but in a way that flattens the past and that flattens cultural diversity in for the sake of one particular single mold. Um, I am going to have to start wrapping this up. But before I do, I would like to share the point that Lauren was making, that following the question about non-Anglo-European representations of trans identities, there is an excellent exhibition about indigenous queer identities in Samoa at the Whitworth in Manchester. So anyone who is in the north of England or close by can go and get some of that for us. Um, there are lots of thanks in the chat as well that I would like to make my own to our three great participants. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you very much, Santi, for a fascinating roundtable on the visibility and the belonging of trans identities in the creative industry. With this, we are bringing to a close our first day of the 6th Creative Industries Festival at Brookes. But we resume together we resume again with more online content tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of you again at that point. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to our participants, and have a lovely rest of your day.
I'd also like to add my thanks as well as to the speakers, but also to Alon for chairing today so brilliantly.
Yes.
And for everyone back tomorrow, it's the same link. We're keeping it simple. So just, come and join us again. We kick off at 11 with the union representatives from Equity, the Actors Union, and the Musicians Union, talking about the labour politics of the creative industries, some more, as obviously it's come up quite a lot already. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.